Welcome to this Brain Shark on the importance of attachment. Here you see me, Dr. Lisa Firestone, Director of Research and Education for the GLENDON Association. The GLENDON Association provides good psychological information for professionals, and our sister website, PsychAlive, provides good psychological information for the general public. So let's talk about attachment theory. Attachment theory was originally developed by Sir John Bowlby, and he got interested in attachment for two reasons. One is that when he was a small child, he was raised by a nanny coming from an upper-crust British family, and when he was 4 years old, his nanny was fired, and he lost his main attachment figure or source of security. The other reason is that in England during World War II, when London was being bombed, many of the children of the city were sent to live in the countryside, and yet they did not do well being separated from their parents. Often they got quite depressed and despondent. And I also want to mention Harry Harlow and Renee Spitz's work, because I think that affected the development of attachment theory as well. Harry Harlow did research with rhesus monkeys and did research looking at how different types of rearing patterns, whether they were reared by their real mother, by a cloth mother or wire mother, or peer rearing, how that affected their development. Again, how these monkeys, who are very social creatures, were affected by attachment. And then we have Renee Spitz, who studied orphans after World War II, who were in orphanages and where they got all of their physical needs met, but they didn't have one main attachment figure or adult taking care of them, and many of them failed to thrive and actually died because they didn't have an attachment figure. Now I'm also going to mention Mary Ainsworth. She's the person who operationalized or started to research Bowlby's theory of attachment, and she did this by developing a research paradigm where you would have a mother and child come into a playroom, and the mother would leave once and then she would leave twice, and what she actually measured was reunion behavior on the second reunion, because she found that two separations were enough to stress the relationship between parent and child for them to manifest their attachment pattern. And what she found were different patterns of attachment between parent and child that we'll discuss in a minute. Now, I'm going to mention the work of Mary Main and Eric Hesse. Now, attachment research has been done all over the world and across cultures at this point, but I'm going to particularly mention the additions that Mary Main and Eric Hesse made to attachment. And one of those additions was the development of the adult attachment interview. And this is a research instrument where you interview an adult, a parent, or a soon-to-be parent, about their childhood, and that stresses people enough to reveal their attachment pattern in terms of how they're able to talk about their own early experiences while staying in good relationship with the person interviewing them. They also found a fourth type of attachment. Mary Main found three types of attachment in her work: secure attachment, and then two forms of what she called insecure attachment: anxious insecure attachment and avoidant insecure attachment. What Mary Main found was a fourth type of attachment, disorganized attachment, and I'll define each of these attachment patterns in a minute. So let's talk about the different types of attachment that have been discovered. So the first, again, three categories were discovered by Mary Ainsworth in her research. So the first category of attachment, and the most ideal, is secure attachment. And that is where a parent is emotionally available, perceptive, and responsive. And what this looks like in the strange situation is a child who's upset when their parent is gone, but when the parent comes back, they go to the parent to be comforted, they get comforted, and then they go down and are able to explore the room again. So they use their parent as a secure base, and then they also feel free to go down and explore the environment. What it looks like on the adult attachment interview developed by Mary Main is a person who can talk about their childhood in a way that makes sense. They understand the importance of different things that happen to them. They can even have had a very painful childhood, but they can talk about it in an organized way and make sense out of it. The next type of attachment that Mary Ainsworth found in her research was avoidant attachment. And this is an attachment pattern where the parent is emotionally unavailable, imperceptive, unresponsive, and even rejecting of the child. And what this looked like in the strange situation in Mary Ainsworth's research was a child who acted like they didn't care when their parent left, and also like they didn't care when their parent came back. They just kept playing with the toys. But later on, when research was done where they put a heart rate monitor on the child, the child was anxious when the parent was out of the room, and they felt relieved when the parent came back, even though they didn't show it with any outward behavior. So this is a child that's learned that the best way to get my needs met with this parent is to act like I don't have any. And what it looks like on the adult attachment interview is when you ask an adult about their attachment history or about what it was like when they were growing up, they say, "It was fine, but I don't remember much before about age 15. Next question. They just aren't able to produce or talk about their childhood very much or reflect on it. The third type that Mary Ainsworth found in her research, she called anxious ambivalent attachment. And what that looks like is a parent who is inconsistently available, sometimes perceptive and responsive, but other times intrusive, and responding to the child more out of their needs than out of the child's needs. So what did this look like in the strange situation? When the parent would leave, the child would be very, very upset. And when the parent would come back, they would go to their parent to be comforted. The parent would pick up the child, and the child would cling to the parent and still be quite upset, and it would take a very long time to get comforted, and would be afraid to go back down and play with the toys, and would want to just cling to the parent so they wouldn't be left again. Now, what did it look like in the adult attachment interview research that Mary Main did? When this person was asked about their childhood, they would start to talk about their childhood, but then they would launch into how they still felt hurt by their parent or what was still going on with their parent today, even though that isn't what the examiner had asked. So that was not staying in an appropriate relationship with the examiner while talking about their childhood. Now, the next type of attachment was the one that, again, was discovered by Mary Main and Eric Hesse in their research, and they called this disorganized attachment. And what that looks like is a parent who is either frightening to the child or who gets frightened when the child comes to them for safety is disorienting and alarming. So what did this look like in the strange situation? This is a child who wouldn't know whether to go toward the parent to get comforted or whether to run away from that parent because they were afraid of them. So the first thing the child would often do is start to approach the parent to get their needs met, but when they get close to the parent, they would actually do behavior that was inconsistent. So maybe they would run toward the parent, but when they got close, they would turn and run away. Or they would run toward the parent, but then they would run past the parent and try to run out of the room. Or they would just collapse in a ball on the floor when they got close to the parent and start hitting the floor. Or maybe they would even hit the parent. They just didn't know what to do to get their needs met by this parent. And what did it look like on the adult attachment interview for Mary Main's work? When this person would try to talk about their childhood or reflect on their attachment history as an adult, they would say things that didn't make sense. When they gave words, for instance, to describe the relationship between themselves and their mother when they were a child and then asked to give a story to back that up, the stories wouldn't match. Or they would say things that were inconsistent or didn't make sense, but they wouldn't notice that they had done that. So, when we look at attachment patterns, what we found is that in low-risk or non-clinical populations, the general public, if you will, that about 55 to 65% of parent-child relationships look like a secure attachment. About 5 to 15% look like ambivalent attachment, that kind of anxious, clinging attachment, and about 20 to 30% of the general population have an avoidant attachment, that looking like they don't need anything from the parent type of attachment. And about 20 to 40% also have a disorganized attachment. The reason this doesn't add up to 100 is because when 100% is because when somebody's given a disorganized attachment, they're also given the next best fit type of attachment. So disorganized secure, disorganized ambivalent, or disorganized avoidant. But in high-risk parentally maltreated samples, what we see is that disorganized attachment occurs in about 80% of parent-child relationships. So what causes insecure attachment between parent and child? What was found in research is that unresolved trauma or loss in the life of parents statistically predicts attachment style far more than maternal sensitivity ratings, than child temperament, what the child came into the world with, or the social status of the family, or the culture of the family. And again, this research has been done cross-culturally at this point. So what is unresolved trauma and loss in the life of the parent, and how is that affecting how they parent? So how does unresolved trauma or loss in the life of a parent lead to disorganized attachment between parent and child? Well, I think to understand that, we have to look at implicit versus explicit memory to understand what's going on in moments of stress with parents who have unresolved trauma and loss. So first of all, implicit memory is the type of memory that is online from before we're even born. And motor memory is implicit memory, so I think this is a good way of thinking about it. If I brought out a bike and said, get on this bike and ride, you would just get on the bike and ride. You wouldn't think about remembering, how do I ride a bike? It wouldn't feel like you were remembering, you would just do it. Implicit memory is like that. So if you've had trauma in your early childhood and maybe you were beaten in a room that had a certain kind of wallpaper, and then you go over to a friend's house and they have that certain kind of wallpaper on their wall, you may just have this awful feeling like you need to get out of there. You won't remember the wallpaper or maybe even remember the beating that you had, but you will just have an implicit memory in your body that this is something dangerous that you need to get away from, okay? That's implicit memory. Now, explicit memory comes online, or we start to develop it at around age 3 because it takes our hippocampus, and the hippocampus doesn't fully develop in our brains until we're about 3 years old. Now, implicit memories, unlike implicit memories, feel like you're remembering when you tell them. So if I asked you to tell me the story of how you learned to ride a bike, you would tell me a story, right? And it would feel like you were remembering that story from your childhood. So, how does disorganized attachment get passed from one generation to the next? So we believe that implicit memories of terrifying experiences may be flooding the parent, particularly at moments of stress between them and their child. And these terrifying memories lead to impulsive behaviors, distorted perceptions of their child, rigid thoughts and impaired decision-making patterns, and difficulty tolerating a range of emotions in their child. So at moments of stress between a parent and a child, what is going on in their brain that's leading to this bad behavior on the part of parents? To understand that, I think we need to turn to the work of Dr. Dan Siegel in interpersonal neurobiology. And this is his handy hand model of the brain. And what it does is basically explain the different levels of our brain and how they interact, and how at moments of stress between parent and child, a parent has basically flipped their lid, and the higher functions of their brain are offline. And the higher functions of our brain do two things. They allow us to have a broader range of options in terms of our behavior by allowing us to not do a lot of things that we would instinctively do, and also by giving us access to being able to have higher thought processes that allow us to make better choices. So at times of stress, basically the highest centers of our brain are offline. We've, quote, flipped our lid, and the emotional centers of our brain are firing out of control. So what is happening when we, quote, flip our lid? One thing that happens is that we lose the 9 important functions of our middle prefrontal cortex. This is a very important part of our brain that is just behind our eyes, and it has a direct connection to the higher functions of our brain, to the emotional centers of our brain, and directly to our bodies through our brainstem. So at times when we, quote, flip our lid, we lose the 9 important functions of this middle prefrontal cortex, a very integrative part of our brain. It allows us to regulate our body. It allows us to have attunement with other people. It allows us to have emotional balance, to keep our emotions balanced, to have response flexibility or a pause button to think before we act, to have empathy, to be able to see something from another person's perspective, to have self-knowing awareness or insight, to understand what's going on inside of ourselves, something we might gain from our book, Conquer Your Critical Inner Voice, to have fear modulation, to be able to calm down our fear, to have intuition, and to have morality. So when we have, quote, flipped our lid, we sort of lose our moral compass. We react to our children in ways that are not attuned, that are not flexible, where we're not having empathy, and we're not going to be our best selves in our parenting. So when someone has a secure attachment, they develop flexible